Steve, we've had two downgrades to global growth, one in January and then one in April. And at the same time, we are still looking at more downside risks to the global economy. So yes, the war in Ukraine has been a significant hit to recoveries around the world as commodity prices have gone up. Inflation is at record highs in many economies. Major central banks are now looking to raise interest rates much more quickly than was expected just a couple of months ago. And China, in April, the data that we saw coming out of China was very weak. So there are a confluence of negative shocks at a time when the global economy was already slowing significantly.
What are the ramifications if those central banks lose their nerve? Already we're hearing some voices at the Fed and elsewhere saying after the 250 basis point rises that are penciled in at the moment, there should be some form of pause as well. But that won't take us to anywhere near positive real rates.
The Fed is grappling with very high inflation, and it's not just headline inflation, but any other measure of inflation that you look at. So it's very broad-based. So this is squarely something that the Fed needs to address. If you take the path of interest rates that is expected, which is around 275 basis points or so, inflation is expected to come down. But the more important thing is that it will stay elevated above the 2% target for quite a while. And that is a big challenge because once you live in a world where off the 2% target for a long time, there is the risk of inflation expectations de-anchoring. And that's something that has to be top of mind for central bankers.
Yeah, for sure. And look, the word that a lot of people thought would never happen but is happening potentially is stagflation, given what you're talking about economic slowdowns, plus the inflationary impulse at the moment. Do we have the tools to combat stagflation? Do the politicians have the nerve to combat stagflation?
Firstly, I would point out that our current projection for global growth, which was in April, was 3.6%. Now, that is quite a fairly strong number, especially if compared to the past decade average. So there is some buffer in there in the global economy. We've seen labor markets recover very strongly. We have seen household and corporate balance sheets in many countries to be in good shape. So I do think there is some source of resilience. But we are in times when we're getting pounded by one shock after another. And of a magnitude that we could not have expected. So we are in very precarious times. But at the same time, I would say, given the strength of the recovery we've seen, especially in major economies, there is a possibility that we could bring inflation down while not slipping into any kind of a deep recession.
The conundrum for many also is what's going on in the labour market, and you referred to that already, because the JOLTS data, for instance, shows this enormous lack of employees available for the jobs that are open at the moment. We've seen huge wage demands, not only in the US, but beginning to come through in areas such as Europe as well. It's confounding a lot of people. Will the labour market become less tight very quickly, given the concerns about slowdown?
So the recovery has been very strong, like you said, in the labour market in many parts of the world. We've seen wage inflation to be very high in the US, less high in the euro area, high in the United Kingdom and in Canada. So we are seeing strong recoveries. Now, labour force participation is not back to what it was in several of these countries. We still have the hesitancy of returning to work. That can change over time. It is improving, so we could see more labour coming in. But what we do need is some softening of the demand side of the equation, which is what central bank governors can bring about.
That's what historically we're told they are able to cope with. Tell me about the war and what the ramifications for food, for energy, and especially, I guess, on the food side of things, because we haven't had a food crisis, a global food crisis, for a very, very long time. It is something that Jane Fraser on the panel with Mrs. Georgieva mentioned as well. It could really be an extra terrifying factor, especially for certain parts of the world where, quite frankly, don't have the same availability to food as the West, potentially.
This is a major concern for us, and we've seen food prices go up sizably over the last several months. But I actually think that there is the risk of much more being ahead of us than what we have seen so far, because we are still in a situation where we're in the sowing season. Now we're seeing shortages of fertilizers. We have about 20 countries that we've seen put export restrictions on food. All of that could feed into much higher price spirals. And, there are parts of the world like sub-Saharan Africa where food is about 40% of their consumption basket, which is highly consequential for their cost of living.